figures in professional wrestling history who were as explosive, unpredictable, and unforgettable as the Ultimate Warrior. With his face paint, wild entrance, intense promos, and incredible energy, Warrior looked less like a traditional wrestler and more like a superhero who had somehow stepped into a wrestling ring. For millions of fans, he represented pure power, excitement, and heroism. But behind the paint was Jim Hellwig, a man whose journey to becoming the Ultimate Warrior was far more complicated than the character suggested. This is the story explored in Dark Side of the Ring, Becoming Warrior. Before becoming one of wrestling's biggest stars, Jim Hellwig wasn't planning to become a wrestling icon. He had dreams that were far removed from the world of professional wrestling. He was interested in bodybuilding and had aspirations connected to becoming a chiropractor. But his physical appearance quickly became an important part of his future. Hellwig had the kind of muscular physique that wrestling promoters were looking for, and eventually he entered professional wrestling. His early career helped him discover something important. He wasn't simply going to wrestle as himself. He was going to create a character. The transformation began with the colorful face paint, the explosive movements, the intensity, and eventually the name that would become legendary, the Ultimate Warrior. Warrior was unlike almost anyone else. He didn't walk toward the ring. He sprinted. He didn't calmly deliver interviews. He screamed with incredible intensity. His entire presentation was designed to make him feel larger than life. And it worked. As the late 1980s arrived, the Ultimate Warrior began rising rapidly through the ranks of the World Wrestling Federation. Vince McMahon had built the company around larger-than-life personalities, and Warrior fit perfectly into that world. But becoming a superstar came with consequences. The more popular Warrior became, the more the character began to dominate his life. Those close to him described a man who increasingly believed in the Warrior persona. The line between Jim Hellwig and the Ultimate Warrior became increasingly difficult to separate. And then came the moment that established Warrior as one of the biggest stars in wrestling. At WrestleMania VI in 1990, Warrior faced Hulk Hogan in one of the most famous matches in WWF history. Hogan had been the company's dominant superhero for years. Now the company was looking toward the future. Warrior defeated Hogan and became the WWF champion, completing his transformation from rising star into the industry's newest centerpiece. For fans watching at home, it was a spectacular moment. But behind the scenes, the situation was much more complicated. Warrior's relationship with WWF management became increasingly difficult. His enormous popularity gave him bargaining power, and his demands created tension with Vince McMahon and the company. Eventually, the relationship began to fall apart. The same personality that helped make Warrior a superstar could also make him extremely difficult to work with. And this is where Becoming Warrior becomes more than a story about wrestling success. The documentary looks at the difference between the character fans loved and the man behind the character. His first wife, Shari Tyree, provides a deeply personal perspective on Jim Hellwig and the changes she witnessed as his wrestling career exploded. Her perspective helps show that the story wasn't simply about a wrestler becoming famous. It was about a person whose identity became increasingly connected to the larger-than-life character he had created. Warrior's career would continue through several dramatic chapters. There were major victories, controversial departures, returns, and conflicts that continued to shape his reputation. His relationship with wrestling fans also became complicated. Some remembered the Ultimate Warrior as an incredible childhood hero, a symbol of strength and determination. Others remembered the controversies surrounding Jim Hellwig and questioned the man behind the face paint. And that contradiction is what makes his story so fascinating. The Ultimate Warrior could inspire millions of people, while simultaneously becoming one of the most polarizing personalities in professional wrestling. Years after his original run, Warrior's relationship with WWE eventually changed. In 2014, he returned to the company and was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. For many fans, it was a surprising moment. The man who had spent years separated from WWE was suddenly back on the company's biggest stage. But the celebration would be tragically short. Just days after his Hall of Fame induction and WrestleMania weekend appearances, Jim Hellwig died on April 8, 2014, at the age of 54. His death transformed the meaning of his return. Suddenly, the final chapter of the Ultimate Warrior story wasn't about another controversy or another wrestling comeback. It was about a legendary character whose life had come to an unexpected end. And that is ultimately what makes becoming Warrior such a compelling chapter in Dark Side of the Ring. The story isn't simply about whether the Ultimate Warrior was a hero or a villain. It is about how a man named Jim Hellwig created one of the most recognizable characters wrestling had ever seen, and how that character eventually became almost impossible to separate from the person underneath. The Ultimate Warrior was loud. He was intense. He was controversial. He was sometimes difficult to understand. But there is no denying his impact. For an entire generation of wrestling fans, the image of that face paint, those colorful tassels, and that explosive sprint toward the ring remains unforgettable. So the Warrior may have been a complicated man, but the Ultimate Warrior became something much bigger. He became a wrestling icon. And whether fans remember him with admiration, criticism, nostalgia, or all three, one thing is certain. The Ultimate Warrior left behind a legacy that professional wrestling will never completely escape. This was Dark Side of the Ring, Becoming Warrior, the rise, transformation, controversy, and complicated legacy of one of wrestling's most unforgettable figures.